Let's go ahead and get started if we could. Go ahead and find a seat, and we'll start our Wednesday evening services this evening. Brother Jimmy's prepared to go. Brother Johnny Garner is going to be leading us in a song in just a few minutes. After I deliver the announcements, we're going to ask Brother Perry Ramsey, if he would, he'll stand in the back and deliver our opening prayer for us. So, announcements, Brother Perry will lead a prayer, Johnny will lead us in an opening song, and then we'll hear from Brother Jimmy this evening. Those in need of prayer, Nelda Johnson is scheduled for 2 medical procedures in Tyler Tuesday, 4 and 20. That's next week. She's asked for prayers that the procedures go well. But she's also in need of someone to drive her to the appointments and back home. So if someone can assist Nelda in going over to Tyler, taking her on Tuesday, April the 20th, that'd be fantastic. Please get with her if you can help. Her number is, and it's on the, I'll just let you get it off of this deal here. I hate to give out her number in public too much, sometimes wonder about that. But let's see if we can help Nelda get some assistance there, getting over to for that medical procedure. Charles Chance, that's Paula Thompson's brother, has been placed on hospice care, and we certainly want to be in prayer for that family, and certainly remembering Paula and Wayne as they go through that journey. We have some events and announcements. There's a sign-up sheet on the back table for all ladies to indicate if they're interested in attending the retreat this year. It is scheduled for September the 24th through the 26th. And as usual, they'll need to start preparing for it as soon as possible and need an approximate account. So if you're interested in participating in the ladies' retreat again this year, and that's always been a great event. The ladies really enjoyed it, and I think very beneficial. So thinking about going, can make that consideration. Let's go ahead and commit, and you can let them know if you're going or not to get that head count. The Welcome Back to Mayberry will be held this Saturday from 6 to 7 p.m. The featured episode is Andy Forecloses, and bring your favorite finger foods and enjoy. That's always been an enjoyable event as well. Brother Tony will be hosting that. There will be a graveside service for Glenda Cheatham Wednesday, 4/21 at 10:30 a.m. at the Livelyville Cemetery. So that's on Wednesday, a graveside services for Glenda Cheatham. So remember that. Anything else we need to be mindful of, Johnny? Dorothy Allen's grandson passed away. The funeral is Friday. Okay. Jackie? Okay. Co-worker of yours and Johnny's mother passed away also, right? All right. Be mindful of that as well. Anything else that we need to be mindful of? Brother Jimmy? Yep. Oh, my goodness. In case you didn't hear that, Brother Jerry Clay had misstepped off of a ladder, I guess, this afternoon, and is apparently maybe injured his back or side or something. As you can imagine, it's quite a bit of pain. And just remember Brother Jerry as well as he goes through that. Always good to keep up on these things. Anything else, anyone else we need to hear from? If not, Brother Perry, would you lead us in that prayer?
627. 627 will be our song before we're dismissed to go to classes. If you would, y'all go and be standing. We sing this song. After the end of the song, the classes will be dismissed to go to the back. 627. Let's stand. Glory Land Way. I'm in the way, the bright and shining way. I'm in the glory land way. Telling the world that Jesus saved today. Yes, I'm in the glory land way. I'm in the glory land way. I'm in the glory land way. Heaven is nearer and the way groweth clearer, for I'm in the glory land way. Listen to the call, the gospel call today. Get in the glory land way. Wonders come home, oh, hasten to obey, for I'm in the glory land way. I'm in the glory land way. I'm in the glory land way. Heaven is nearer and the way groweth clearer, for I'm in the glory land way. Onward I go, rejoicing in His love. I'm in the glory land way. Soon I shall see Him in that home above. Oh, I'm in the glory land way. I'm in the glory land way. I'm in the glory land way. Heaven is nearer and the way groweth clearer, for I'm in the glory land way. Dismissed to go to classes. Those auditorium mark 272. 270.
Everybody, grab your Bibles if you would and turn to Galatians chapter 4 for a few minutes tonight. Galatians chapter 4. I want to begin reading in verse 8, Galatians chapter 4, and that'll put us in the context of where we're going to begin and spend a few moments together tonight. Paul says, "Formerly, when you did not know God, you were servants or slaves to those who by nature are not God's. But now that you know God, or rather are known by Him, how is it that you're turning back to those weak and miserable forces? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? You're observing special days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that somehow I've wasted my efforts. I plead with you," verse 12 says, "brothers and sisters, become like me, for I became like you. You did me no wrong, for as you know, it was because of an illness that I first preached the gospel to you. And even though my illness was a trial to you, you didn't treat me with contempt or scorn. Instead, you welcomed me as if I were an angel of God, as if I were Christ Himself. Where then is your blessing of me now? I can testify that if you could have done so, you would have torn out your very eyes and given them to me. Have I now become your enemy because I'm telling you the truth? Those people are zealous to win you over, but not for good. What they want is to alienate you from us so that you may be or have zeal for them. It's fine to be zealous, provided the purpose is good, and to be so always, not just when I'm with you. My dear children, for whom I am again in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in you, how I wish that I could be with you now and change my tone because I am perplexed about you." You know, there are a lot of folks, if you read very much that commentators have to say about Scripture and the characters that are explained or revealed to us there are a lot of commentators who view Paul as a very hard unemotional, disconnected type individual, a driven type A personality that found very little time or very little room for personal relationships with people. And I guess because of the strength of his doctrinal convictions, I can understand someone maybe coming to that conclusion. But the truth is, at least in my estimation, and what we're finding revealed to us here, is that Paul was deeply involved, deeply committed to the human relationships, particularly among those who he knew well. Now, a number of times, and we're not going to go into a personal history of Paul's life, but if you read almost any of Paul's letters, you see somewhere in there a mention of or a emphasis on his commitment to praying for and on behalf of those brethren. Sometimes even brethren that he has very little personal acquaintance with. Now, I'm saying all that to say this. It ought to be pretty clear to us if we read only the section that we just read with an open mind, that Paul's deeply hurt. It's a personal affront, not in terms of him being attacked as an individual, but in relation to his desire to see people saved, for them to persevere, for them to be faithful to God. Paul's willing to go to any length. He's willing to defend whatever needs to be defended. He's willing to go wherever he's needed to be present at. He's willing to do whatever needs to be done. And what we see happening here in the midst of a very doctrinal letter, we see some very personal emotion and very personal convictions about the depth of his relationship to the church in Galatia. Now, you remember, or the church is in the region of Galatia. Now, you remember that we're reading a letter, studying a letter that was written to address the problem of the church being attacked by Judaizing teachers. And by Judaizing teachers, I mean people who sought to bind back the law of Moses even on Gentiles who had now become Christians. People who, in the truest sense of the word, were legalists. They were people who believed that Jesus is good and his ministry is wonderful and salvation's a blessing and the church is important, and they would say all those things, but you still have to live up to some of the requirements made under the law of Moses. Now, I think by this point, and if not, we certainly will by the time we finish the end of this letter, if the Lord lets us do that, it certainly ought to be clear to us by now that any effort on our part to earn or deserve God's favor is in no means or under no circumstances the conditions by which we're forgiven. We're redeemed by the blood of Christ. Our response to that sacrifice is a living, active, saving faith. Okay? We are in fact saved by faith because it's in faith that God credits us with righteousness, just like we talked about him doing for Abraham, and then saying it wasn't just for Abraham. It's for all of us who live by faith. And we've talked about at length the definition and the description of what true saving faith is, what it does, how it acts, how it responds. But Paul pauses in the midst of a very powerful doctrinal treatise. And he reflects back for a moment. He says, okay, I know I've poured out a lot of information here. I know that I've really challenged you doctrinally on some deep levels, but let's just think practically for a moment. Let's think personally for a moment. And he reflects back to the time in their life, these Gentile believers, when they didn't know anything about God. They had no faith in God. In fact, they were, he says, enslaved to those who weren't even God's. And really the truth of it is, unless we're in a right relationship with Jehovah God, we are enslaved still to someone who isn't God, right? I mean, that could be said of every person. Before we became believers, before we became Christians, all of us were in fact enslaved to those fundamental legalistic principles of trying to work hard enough, measure ourselves against each other and say that I'm better than you or you're better than so-and-so, and this elaborate system that's really nothing more than an attempt to justify ourselves when step number one in being rescued from our sin is realizing we can't do it ourselves. We can't earn God's favor. We can't achieve God's forgiveness by our performance. Now, Paul begins this section, and I read all the way down through verse 20 on purpose because it's kind of in this section that Paul really betrays the fact. He really reveals the fact that he's deeply anxious. And it's interesting, in fact, if you have your outline, and I haven't done much in way of following that study guide, but if you have your outline, you'll notice that there are three statements that are made. Three statements that really kind of highlight what Paul's got to say in this section. The first thing he says is in verse 11 in the NIV, I fear for you. I fear for you. We'll talk about that in a minute. Second thing he says in verse 12 is, I plead with you. And then he ends the section in verse 20 by saying, I am perplexed about you. Now let's back up and talk about what it was that Paul said he was afraid concerning. He says, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who by nature are not God. But now that you know God, or rather, more accurately, you're known by God, how is it that you're turning back to those weak and miserable forces? Now, let me pause there and ask the question, how is it, or in what way is it that these Christians were in danger of turning back to what Paul calls these weak and miserable forces? What was happening that caused Paul to say that? How can you be turning back to these weak forces, he says? What's happening there? They were making some headway, weren't they? They were convincing these people that maybe you didn't need to renounce Jesus, but you needed to supplement Jesus. You needed to supplement Jesus. And really, Paul refers to legalism in a lot of different ways, using a lot of different terms. And sometimes we get kind of tangled up, I think, when we use words like that because it automatically brings certain images to our mind that limits our seeing the bigger picture. But think about it. Outside of Christ, what options are there other than you better be strong enough, sinless enough, perfect enough to pull yourself up spiritually by your own bootstraps? What other option is there? There is none. Either a man's declared right with God because he's good enough to do it himself, or he accepts the fact that he can't do it for himself and Jesus did it for us. Now that's very simplified, but that's the gospel in a statement. That's the basic outline of what formulates or stipulates the beginning of the gospel. He said, I can't believe that you who were so long enslaved to those fundamental ungodly things that didn't make you right with God, that now having become Christians, having known God, and then he says, better way to say that is, now God knowing you. I can't believe, he says, I am concerned, anxious, fearful, that you're turning right back to what you were rescued from. Now explain to me again, or let's discuss again, how it is that Paul would be so descriptive, how he would be so, he uses such strong language in talking about something so simple as these Judaizing teachers teaching you need to be circumcised. You need to quit eating the things that the law of Moses forbade you to eat and start eating the things, and you need to observe those special holy days that God has always expected his people to. How can that be so bad? How can that be so bad? How can it be something that Paul would say causes him to be afraid, fearful? I'm in fear for you. And something so important that he would say you're turning back to those weak and miserable forces. That's exactly, and that's the whole thing right there, Joe. In a statement, that's exactly the problem. You see, it is undermining and discrediting the fact that Jesus did what he claims to have done. What legalism says is, in essence, Jesus did a lot, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough, because you're going to have to supplement it with some other things. Now, that's not the gospel. That's not the gospel. In fact, that's reverting right back to what it was they had been rescued from, he says. And he's talking to Gentiles, by the way, primarily. Charlie?
That's the point I believe Paul is making. False doctrine is false doctrine, whether or not it came from the Jews or
That's
whether
right.
it came from the
That's right.
There's no difference. It still leads to death. And the only option is you
By faith, that's right.
through Jesus Christ.
That's right.
That you have salvation. Anything other, whether these are devout Jews or whether they're pagans, it
That's
doesn't
right.
matter. Neither one will save you.
You know, that goes back to the point that we've made several times that I think we really need to appreciate more and think of more readily, quickly. The fact that the Jews had a more detailed law or revelation from God didn't, in terms of them being righteous, put them in any better position than the position the Gentiles were already in with the law they had. Now, I did not say that the law of Moses wasn't important. I didn't say that it didn't play some powerful roles, that it didn't reveal God in more detail than it had ever been before. I didn't say a lot of things that criticized the law. What I said was, in terms of being right with God, the law of Moses was no more able to produce rightness with God than the law the Gentiles already had. Now let's go back and ask one more time, what law did the Gentiles have? If it wasn't the law of Moses, what was it?
It could have been the law of conscience,
Okay,
or it could have been other heathen
man-made laws?
laws.
Yes. Well, we know this much for sure. If we go back to Romans chapter 1, we know this much in chapter 2. We discover that God has always given men law. And he calls it a law that's written on the Gentiles' heart, Paul does in the letter to the Romans. And if we trace back through Bible history, we discover, among other things, that when sin entered the world, the reason sin entered the world, well, that's not the right way to say it. The means by which sin entered the world was participating in or eating the fruit of a tree that God had forbidden them to eat from. And the name of that tree, you remember, was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what I'm saying to you is that day things changed in a lot of ways. In some ways that we recognize quickly, easily. But some ways maybe that we haven't yet thought of. I mean, what happened as a result or a consequence of participating in sin or rebellion against the will of God was that a law was written on man's heart that, well, we were no more effective at living up to than the Jews were the law of Moses, okay? So whatever that law is, whatever legal code, whether it's a revelation from God or it's a man-made rule list that tries to make a man right by performance, always results in the same thing. And we need to really be strong and understand that that's true, because I think if we're not careful, we would never say it, but we kind of devise the thought process that we need to help God too. You know? Again, we would never say that. We would never say something like that. But it's almost like in terms of formulating a doctrine, it seems that we kind of think that way sometimes. And remember, he's talking to Gentiles. He's not really talking about the law of Moses here. That's not what these Christians had been enslaved to. It was the principle of law, which is much bigger than just the law of Moses. It was the principle of law. You understand whether that makes sense? That includes the law of Moses and every other means by which a man tries to earn the favor or the righteousness of God. And you can't. It can't. So Paul says, I'm afraid. I'm afraid. I'm concerned. Now, the fear that he talks about isn't being terrified. He's so deeply concerned that he says, I utterly am, well, it's hard to come up with another word that wraps all that's involved in fear in a word. But it's not just trembling. It's him saying, I'm really deeply concerned that I've wasted my time preaching to you, and you've wasted your time professing faith because you're turning right back to the very thing that you were rescued from. You're giving up the faith. You're falling from grace. And he'll tell us that further in our study. He says, but now, verse 9, even though you were once slaves, now you have become known by God. How are you turning back to those weak and miserable forces? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? Now, let me just say, I suspect that neither the false teachers, the Judaizing teachers in Galatia, nor the brethren who were listening to them would have said, we want to turn back to law. I don't think anybody would have made that profession or that claim. But what they were doing by their actions is proving that they were slowly, steadily swallowing this deception that for some reason appeals to human nature anyway. That we can be good enough, that we can work hard enough, that we can perform well enough, that we comparing ourselves among ourselves with each other feel pretty good about ourselves. Problem is that isn't the standard of righteousness. That isn't the measure of a faithfulness of a man or the salvation of a man. So he goes back and he says, do you really want to be enslaved again to that? Because that's what you're doing, he said. That's what you're in danger of doing. That's why I'm fearful, he says. Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? You're observing special days, months, seasons, and years. I fear for you that somehow I've wasted my efforts on you. Now, I'm not trying to be funny, but I've heard that verse quoted all my life, talking about Christmas and Easter and why Christians oughtn't to ever have any connection with those kind of things. I've heard that all my life. And the only thing I'm going to say about that is that has absolutely nothing to do with this context. Okay? I'm going to let that doctrinal progression or thought process, I'm going to let it stand where it stands. All I'm going to say to you is that has nothing to do with what Paul's talking about here. What Paul's talking about here is you're going back to Judaism even though you're not Jews, and especially now that you're Christians. You're going back to the very things that you were released from. And part of what they were released from was all the holy days and the festivals and the feasts that were bound upon the Jews under the law of Moses or under the Mosaic covenant. He said, I'm afraid. And look at your very practice. Look at what you're doing. Look at what you're doing. Let me say it this way. While it's wonderful to appreciate the significance of the Passover, for example, what does it say if we still celebrated the Passover the way the Jews did? What does it say? I mean, you can interpret it. You might intend for it to honor God. That might be what you intend for it to do, but you know what it does? It dishonors God because it pretends Jesus didn't finish the job. You know, that he's not the Lamb of God that took away the sin of the world. You see, that's the side that we don't think of. That's the part that we sometimes fail to understand. That's why it's hard for us to be, that's why it's dangerous, let me put it this way, for us to rely on human emotion and desire to decide what honors God, and rather than letting God tell us what honors him. I mean, here these people were claiming to be, by faith, saved by the blood of Christ. And I suspect, just because of the significance and the importance of the Passover to the Jews, that they were still trying to go back and do the same things the Jews had done under the previous covenant, the law of Moses or the Mosaic covenant. And Paul says, do you not understand what you're doing here? Do you not understand that by observing something that has been fulfilled, that what you're really doing is saying God didn't finish the job? That doesn't honor God. That disrespects God. That questions God's integrity or his faithfulness or his ability to fulfill his promises. Now, I'm picking on the Passover. There were a lot of others, okay? There were a lot of others, and I'm not saying that because there's some semblance in the Passover that's still very important to us in principle and in application. It's just that we don't celebrate the death angel passing over Egypt, right? That's not what the Passover or what our participation in what Jesus transformed the Passover into. That's not part of what we're talking about. That's not part of what we're faithful to, that we profess every week. Actually, what we profess is that the once and for all sacrifice has been accomplished. And we honor that. We're part of that body. We identify ourselves with that. Okay, I mean, stop. Any comment or question about that? Am I the only one here who heard that verse talking about Christmas and other holidays? I bet I'm not the only one. Jackie?
You know, look at this from the opposite side. You take the rich young ruler and ask him that. He comes to Jesus and says, what must I do?
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus tells him, obey the commandments.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the kicker with this. The man says, which one?
Yep.
And, you know, that's a real question we need to look at. I mean, because we think, well, we do this right, and all that. And maybe we do. But is there some more way than that? But anyway, Jesus gives us this list, and I've been doing this. But then, you know, we got to give this man credit, because he knows, somehow or another, he knows it's not done. And he says, no, what else must I do?
Yeah.
Because, obeying the commandments wasn't,
Wasn't the answer.
he wasn't satisfied with that. He knew he was lacking something. Of course, now we know what he really did was cheating. And that's what we do. It's not about obeying all the commandments.
Right.
It's being in the
Well, Jesus' whole response to the young man was addressing a young man who was self-righteous and arrogant. He was dependent upon himself. And that's the whole reason. In other words, Jesus wasn't confused when he answered, obey the law. He wasn't confused because what he knew was the man hadn't obeyed the law, couldn't obey the law, and probably had felt a little bit of frustration about that, else he wouldn't have been coming asking the question to begin with, okay? I mean, there's a lot that goes into that we can easily overlook. He wasn't recommending being right with God by law. What he was pointing out was, just as the result of the conversation proves, you can't do that. You can't do that. That's not possible. And particularly when he was asked to do something that he was personally unwilling to do. I'm not going to give up my stuff. You know, I got too much stuff. It just happened that Jesus knew what button to touch, right? He could have touched a lot of others, I'm sure. Right.
The whole chapter is about giving something up. Start with this divorce, first section. We go to the young man.
Yeah.
Then we go to, this is what gives me the apostle. Quibbling over which side of the Lord we're going to sit on.
That's right. That's right.
And they didn't understand what the whole thing was about.
They didn't get it at all.
Who's that blind man? This is the guy that I really like. We see this other blind man earlier, a couple chapters earlier. I see stones out there. This guy, and if you understand what a blind man's condition was in that time frame,
Yep.
he had nothing.
That's right. And didn't stand to have anything.
On the great generosity of others.
Yes.
His sole possession was probably a cup made out of wood and his cloak. And, you know, he was crying out, save me, Lord. And people were saying, God,
Yeah,
Everything he owned, he left all to Jesus.
yes.
That's something rich young ruler didn't do.
No, he wasn't prepared for that.
He wasn't willing to give up one, what do you call it, penny or
Yeah, yeah.
shilling or whatever you want to call it.
Right. Well, again, Jesus knew the man's heart much better than the young man knew his heart. And like I say, I admire the question, because that's a good question. What do I need to do to be saved? But really the fact that I'm asking, what do I need to do to be saved? I'm not criticizing the young man, but that proves, or that illustrates what his real problem was, because he believed there was something he could do. There was some amount of sacrifice he could make or some rule he could keep that would give him right relationship with God. And when Jesus asked him for what to him was the impossible, which was submit, he wanted no part of that. Yes, yes. Well, you think about when Jesus called the apostles, and he don't tell us about all of them, but most of those men on the Sea of Galilee that he met there early in his ministry, he called to become his disciples. It's interesting to me that Luke says they left everything and followed Jesus. Now think about that. That's why they made their living. When he called Matthew, he was a tax collector. He left everything, it says, and followed Jesus. So that's the first step, or that's the difficult part of living by faith. Of living by faith is accepting I can't do it myself.
Also, what the apostles or disciples didn't understand, it's not going to be a government body.
Right.
It's going to be love,
Yes.
love your brother, love God first, forget about everything else.
Yes.
Focus on that.
Well, they're confused about that even in the first chapter of Acts. Just before the Lord goes back to heaven, one of the last questions they ask, are you now going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Not the way you think, guys, not the way you have in mind, I'm not. And that's pretty sad. Stop and think about it. But see, Paul says, I'm afraid for you because you're reverting right back to the very thing that you were rescued out of. And again, that's a real danger. That's a real danger, not just for the false teachers in Galatia, for every believer. He goes on to say in verse 12, I plead with you, brothers and sisters, become like me, for I became like you. Now, what does that mean? Become like me because I became like you. Well, he goes on and illustrates that. He said, you did me no wrong. As you know, when I first came to preach the gospel, it was only because of an illness that I came. And my being among you, while I know it was embarrassing and a burden at times, you showed absolutely no concern or embarrassment at all about it. It wasn't, you didn't reject me. You didn't refuse me. You didn't shun me. In fact, he goes on to say, he said, I'm convinced that if you had to tear out your own eyes and give me, you would have done it. You would have done it. So what is he asking here? He says, I'm pleading with you, brothers and sisters, become like me, for I became like you. You remember what the first two chapters of Galatians he spends doing? The first two chapters he spends defending the fact that I am who I told you I was. I'm really an apostle. I really am a special messenger sent by God. I not only saw him, I not only was taught by him and commissioned by him, I didn't receive any education or insight from any of these people you call apostles, and yet you're letting these false teachers come in and say, Paul's not really an apostle. He's not really an apostle. He may be a good guy, but he just doesn't know. He just doesn't understand. He says, how in the world have I now become someone when you were so willing to sacrifice for me, when you loved me so deeply just a short time ago, when you would have pulled out your own eyes, I'm sure figuratively, in an act of selfless generosity to me, sacrifice for my benefit, why are you now treating me like somebody who doesn't know who he's sent by and who doesn't even know the gospel that he's preaching? Why are you treating me like an enemy now? When you embrace me so much as a friend so recently, as a brother. Really what he's doing is he's saying, I can't believe you've let these strangers come in here and convince you that I'm not who you accepted me as so easily, so readily, so visibly, so recently. Man, I can't believe your world's been turned upside down. He said, I didn't treat you that way, and you didn't treat me that way. So I'm pleading with you. Not for my sake, he says, not for the personal relationship, but for avoiding discrediting the message that you so willingly accepted, which is the gospel. I mean, listen as he goes further down. He goes on, he says, you treated me as if I were an angel from God, as if I were Jesus himself. Now again, I think that's a spiritual exaggeration a little bit. They knew he wasn't Jesus, but that's the way they treated him. That's the kind of relationship they had. That's the kind of words he used to describe their feelings for him that were so obvious, he says. I can testify that if you had been or could have done so, you would have torn out your eyes and given them to me. Which, as a sidelight, is something that has led a lot of people to speculate that maybe Paul's thorn in the flesh was blindness or almost blindness or something, and maybe that's true. Again, I would say I'm curious about that, but it doesn't really matter, does it? It doesn't really change anything, because his point is you would have done whatever you needed to do because I was your brother, and you looked at me that way, and I looked at you that way. I treated you that way. What's changed? What's changed? And that's why he asked him in verse 16, have I now become your enemy by telling you the truth? That's a good question. That's a really good question. Because the truth is, sometimes we do make enemies of people by telling the truth, don't we? Sometimes we do. And that was what was in danger of happening here. He says, I'm pleading with you. I'm pleading with you. Sit down and think about this for a moment. Think about how inconsistent what you're doing now is to what you've promised and pledged and been committed to all along. Not just in way of personal relationship, but the message that Paul brought. And then he goes to verse 17. He said, these people are zealous to win you over, but not for good. Not for good. I know they want to be your buddies. I know they want to win you over. They want to count you among their converts. What they really want is to alienate you from us. Us who? Apostles.
Jimmy, a big part of this too, should we talked about before, but these Galatians in this case, that part of the whole routine of Judaism, the teachers and stuff was saying, hey, part of us having a different message, we've got to convince them that Paul is what he said.
That's right.
Once I clear that down,
That's right.
that infrastructure removed, then I will, the rest of it will just.
That's right. You don't read a whole lot other than the fact that they were just hardcore legalists. You don't read a whole lot. You don't read them spending a whole lot of effort or time making very powerful doctrinal attacks against the simplicity of the gospel. What you find them doing a whole lot of time, spending a whole lot of time is attacking the people who brought that message and trying to discredit them. So yes, you're right. You're exactly right. These people are zealous to win you over, but not for good. What they want is to alienate you from us so that they can have zeal. You can have zeal for them. Let me just pause and say something here. It kind of makes me think about 1 Corinthians, the first 2 or 3 chapters, where the church in Corinth was really hung up on, overvaluing the significance of one individual over another individual. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't false teachers and true teachers, that there aren't faithful teachers and unfaithful. It doesn't mean any of that. But what it means is that when we start putting our faith in men, we need to stop and think real hard. When it starts becoming about me, we need to stop and think real hard. Something's not right here. Something's not right here, and that's what Paul's saying. He said, it's about them. Don't make any mistake. It's about them. And you need to see that. He said, you need to be very clear about that.
Jimmy, was his statement because they rejected Paul or because they rejected Christ?
They reject, that's exactly right. It wasn't as when we began the study, one of the things, like I said, that people have accused Paul of was being so willing or so eager for people to acknowledge him. And I don't see that at all. I don't see that at all. In fact, what I see, Paul was willing to take whatever he needed to take for the sake of the gospel or for Christ, for the church. So the real issue is Paul knew that if the false teachers could make an inroad in discrediting Paul, that he's a liar, that he lacks integrity, that he's really not an apostle, that he really is only half a teacher and only knows part of the message, then the truth of the gospel has been undermined. Their faith has been put, rather than on solid footing, on shaky ground. And that's the danger. That's what he's worried about. I think, obviously, Paul was human, and he wanted people to respect and love and appreciate him just like we all do as a human being. But that's not the basis for him making arguments like this. That's not the basis of it. And in fact, that's exactly what he says in 1 Corinthians. He says, look, I don't care whether you like Peter, Paul, John, Andrew, or anybody else better than somebody else. What I'm telling you is Jesus is who we're following, and the rest of us are just servants. Okay? And any picture we come up with other than that, we're missing the point. But I've got to say this as we pass through, and I'm not judging anybody, but there are a lot of people using religion as a way to advance themselves. Okay? It really is about them. And that's a horribly dangerous thing. Horribly dangerous thing. That's what Paul says is happening here. He said, it's fine for you to be zealous as long as you're zealous all the time and zealous for what's right. Zeal by itself isn't enough, right? It's not enough. You got to be zealous for what's right, and you got to be zealous not so that you're impressing somebody, but all the time. Not for show, but for always. My dear children, for whom I am again in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. Does that give you any insight into how Paul feels about these brethren? I don't know what terms you could use. I don't know what illustration you could use that would be more powerful than a mother in the process of giving birth to a child, to illustrate his feelings toward and his relationship with the church. I don't know how you could say it any plainer than that, any deeper than that. He said, how I wish that I could be with you now and change my tone, because I am perplexed about you. I'm worried. I'm genuinely, almost at wit's end in terms of concern for you. Anybody that says Paul doesn't care about people hasn't read much scripture in the New Testament, or hasn't deliberately read much. Maybe they've read it all. They haven't understood very much of it, because that's the words of a man who's deeply. It would have been just as easy for Paul to have said, you know what, you made your bed, lie in it. If you're dumb enough to be sucked into this thing that quickly, then just suffer the consequence for it. Maybe that's the only way you're going to learn. But that isn't the way he feels about it at all, is it? It's not the way he feels about it at all. Okay, any comment? Tony?
We were gentle among you, like a mother caring for her children. We loved you so much that we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well, because you have become so dear to us. Surely you remember, brothers, our toil and hardships. We worked night and day in order not to be a burden to anyone. He loved his enemies dearly. And unrequited love is one of the greatest tragedies in our world today. When you love somebody, and love somebody, and love somebody, and
Yep.
they spit on you. You know?
It is, but it shouldn't be any surprise to us, because that's exactly what Jesus' whole life was like. You know, that's exactly how his ministry is characterized, and certainly his death and crucifixion, you know, the ultimate illustration of that. Joe?
You know, Jimmy, I think this would be the same for any of us. Paul, what pain in this too is how quickly this has happened.
Yes.
Okay, this isn't happening over a decade or 2 decades or anything. You're slowly, methodically, building a case against somebody. This happened. It's like we were friends yesterday, and
And now we're enemies? Yeah.
So what's going on?
Well, and it says a lot about the fact that, Paul's, well, a couple of things. One is this legalistic philosophy of the Judaizing teachers isn't just a minor doctrinal difference among brethren, okay? It's not an issue of maturity or immaturity. It's a matter of salvation or condemnation. And that's why Paul's so passionate in his, and you think about it, even to this point, and we haven't finished the letter yet, but even to this point, Paul has come at this from just about every angle you could possibly imagine in hopes of rescuing these drowning brethren. That's what was happening. They hadn't drowned, but they were drowning, okay? And he's doing whatever he can do, whatever can be done. Again, when it would have been so easy to say, I poured out my heart, I sacrificed so much, I was there when I ought to have been somewhere else, and in fact, I was so sick, maybe I shouldn't have even been preaching at all. And you're going to treat me like this? It would be easy for a human to say, okay, then suffer the consequence and deal with it. Deal with it. Good luck to you. But man, that's the farthest thing from the truth of what's happening here. The farthest thing from the truth. We shouldn't, well, I'll stop. We'll start preaching about it, but stop there. Mark verse 21, please. We'll start talking about an Old Testament illustration. He's going to come at it from one other angle, and a different angle than he even has thus far, in illustrating the contrast between law and grace, or between legalism and salvation by faith. He's going to use an Old Testament illustration, and it's a powerful one, as you would expect from the Holy Spirit anyway. As we finish up our time here tonight, it's entirely appropriate that anytime we come together that we always offer the opportunity for, I think we're getting messed up, and I haven't stopped and talked about this in a long time. I think we get confused a little bit sometimes in our way of thinking that what we're doing when we offer an invitation is offering someone the opportunity to find forgiveness in a place, or find a relationship with God that's not what we can give. You see, you don't need, what you need is forgiveness from God. Let me say it, come at it from a different angle. What you need is forgiveness from God. Now, obviously, you need the forgiveness of your brothers and sisters if something's happened or been done or been said or an attitude manifested that's been harmful to the church. But you're not coming before the priest for absolution. What you're doing is acknowledging a weakness and asking your family to help, asking your family to pray, asking your family to come alongside and support and encourage. I think we make responding to what we call the invitation way too official a transaction sometimes, when what it really is a family action, a family activity. It's a member of the family expressing need. And whatever that need might be, whether it's someone who's out of fellowship with the church, or someone who's never been in a right relationship with God, or it's someone who's just struggling with something that you need help, you need encouragement, you need prayers. That shouldn't be humiliating. It shouldn't be embarrassing. That shouldn't be something that we're too either proud to acknowledge, or that as those who respond to that we ought to make it as easy as it can be. I've always said it takes two things for an invitation to be effective. It takes someone willing to be invited and respond to an invitation, but it takes a host that's eager to make it so that it's easy to come. And those are both important things. So we're closing our service or ending our time together tonight offering that invitation. And you think about who we are and what we have. Through no effort or no deservedness of our own, it's a little overwhelming. It's too good to be true, the gospel that we've been given the opportunity to become recipients of. If you're here tonight and not in a right relationship with God for whatever reason, if we can help, please let us help while we stand together and while we sing.